Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's Tech Talk. We're joined here today with Tommy, and he'll be taking us on a deep dive into serverless architecture in Lambda. Before we get started, let's unmute ourselves and give him a round of applause.
Let's go, Tommy.
Tommy.
Go.
All right, Tommy, take it away.
Thank you, Tessia. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to my Tech Talk. And before I get started, I'd like to thank CoSmith, Jeannie, and Bradcliffe for sponsoring today's Tech Talk. And today I'll be talking about serverless architecture, and more specifically, AWS Lambda. So before I get started on Lambda, I'd like to talk a little bit about serverless architecture. And essentially what it is when the developer don't have to worry about or provide or manage their own server. And instead, these servers or hosting services are provided by some kind of cloud provider. And the cloud provider can provide a wide range of service, such as computing time, storages, networking, and some other software options. And most of the cloud services can be broken down into these four categories. And so from left to right, we have IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service. And in this model of service, the cloud provider essentially only gives the end user a metal box. And the user has to set up everything by themselves. So like the container, the OS environment, the middleware runtime, as well as managing the data and writing the business logic. And so a lot of work, right? And one level up, we have a CaaS, which is container as a service. So in this type of service, the end user does not have to set up their own container, but they still have to set up or manage the OS, the middleware, set up runtime, as well as writing the rest of the business logic. And one level up, we have PaaS, which is platform as a service. And in this form of service, most things are set up for the end user. So all the end user has to do when using this service is to manage the data and write their business logic. And there's a subset of this PaaS. It's called FaaS, which is function as a service. Essentially, in this model of service, all the end user has to do is write business logic. They don't even have to manage the data. And AWS Lambda is in a platform for FaaS. And from left to right, if we compare these services, we are spending, as developer, we're spending less and less time doing stack implementation. And instead, we can spend more time writing out business logic. So what is AWS Lambda, right? AWS Lambda sits in an intersection between several concepts. So first, I'd like to talk about microservice, which is a type of architecture for larger scale application, and it has been really popular in the last decade or so. And essentially what it is you say you have a large application and you break it down into many different containers. For example, a server can be a container, or some kind of endpoint can also be a container, or a database can also be another container. And all these containers for your application interact with each other for the entire application to work, right? And if you take the state of each one of these container or and the interaction between all these container, you get a bunch of events. And events essentially what make a function as a service so popular, because function as a service allows you to trigger different function based on different events from all these containers in a microservice architecture. And AWS Lambda, developed by Amazon in 2014, is essentially a platform for FaaS. So behind the scene, AWS Lambda handles a bunch of stuff. It does load balancing, rapid auto scaling, and error handling. It handles the security for you, and also managed utilization. So you only pay for what you use. If nothing triggers the Lambda functions, and you don't pay for anything. And most importantly, it also handles your OS environment, managed and set up your OS environment. So very handy and very convenient for the developer to use. So how do you use Lambda, right? So first, you have to identify an event source. So like I said before, in a microservice architecture, there can be lots of ways that you can define events. So a state change in some kind of data or some kind of interaction or request to any endpoint, those are all events. And you can take any of those and say those are the event that triggers a Lambda function. And then you can write the business logic, which is the Lambda function. That's where Lambda function comes in. And AWS Lambda is very convenient because it provides lots of different languages for developer to use. And it has the most popular ones, such as C#, Python, Java, Ruby, Go. And in the recent year, they also have runtime API, which allows you to use pretty much any languages you want. And the Lambda function can do a lot of stuff. It can inform your database, fetch something, modify your database, or inform other service, communicate with other service, or it can simply return an object or a string or something like that. So here are some use cases for Lambda function or AWS Lambda. Let's say you are a developer writing a messaging app, right? And a user use the messaging app, sends a text message to their friend, and it triggers a Lambda function that you write. And that Lambda function then again triggers AWS SNS, for example, and that will inform or notify the user's friend that saying, hey, your friend sends you a message. Or you manage a e-commerce store and some user makes a purchase, and that triggers a Lambda function and passing in the business logic from the purchase to, say, the database or the accounting department, informing there's a purchase, right? Or something more personal. Let's say you take a picture on your phone, right? And that picture gets uploaded to something like AWS S3 storage. And that triggers a Lambda function. And the Lambda function would do something like takes the picture, process it, maybe resize it a little bit, and sends it back to the AWS S3 library storage. So lots of possibilities, very convenient. And so here's an example written in Python for a Lambda function. And so first, there are several parts that goes into writing a Lambda function. So first, we have to identify an event. And in this case, the event is an object from line 26 to 30. We can see the event is a purchase that the purchase detail made by some kind of purchase, perhaps from an e-commerce store. And it contains all the information needed about the purchase. And inside this function, starting at line 6, first we extract the data from the event object, right? For example, the product name, the quantity, the unit price. They extract all that. We save it in some variables. And then we generate a UUID, a transaction ID for this specific purchase, right? And then we calculate the total amount based on the event object, event objects, right? And at the end, we just need to return an object saying this transaction ID, what is the product name, and what is the total amount. And it's very simple. This is a very simple example, but Lambda function itself makes writing business logic extremely convenient. So I encourage everyone to try it out. So there are other cloud providers that are also providing alternatives to AWS Lambda. Essentially, it's just a function as a service. And many other companies such as IBM, Microsoft, Google, Oracle all have their own form of platform for FaaS. I encourage you to check them out. Perhaps you can find something that a service that you like more than AWS Lambda. And thank you for listening to my tech talk, and here are my sources. Thank you.
All right, if everyone could please unmute themselves to give another round of applause for Tommy.
Tommy!
Tommy. Good job.
Now let's open up the floor for questions. Due to time, we only have room for one question. Ryan?
Hi Tommy, thank you for the tech talk. So right now I'm currently building my backend with Node and Express. So would you recommend to like building your entire backend on AWS Lambda?
You can. A lot of businesses actually do that. They write their entire backend logic using Lambda. But keep in mind that Lambda is a tool built for microservice. So if your application is it has some microservice architecture, Lambda is excellent for handling the interaction between different containers. But if your Lambda functions are written for something like for monolith architecture application, it might not be the best because the way Lambda works, they do charge you based on the memory you use on the cloud, and the speed can be quite slow for starting a Lambda service that require like a bunch of other service to be to work together. So yeah, if you're like so basically if your application is a microservice, I would say go for it. Otherwise, you can still use Lambda for something smaller like an API. Yeah.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll conclude our talk for tonight. Thank you all for joining us and have a great night, everyone.